And so you're in the room with John, Paul, George, and Ringo, and John isn't really interested, and Yoko is there, taking notes and knitting and reading the newspaper, and completely not bothering anybody. Nobody in that room cares that Yoko is in the room, which goes against this. She's this evil dragon lady who is out to break up the Beatles. So what we've seen in 2.5 hours so far is nothing. And there's even a quote that Peter Jackson discovered that everyone had forgot that Paul had said, that he revealed a year ago in Rolling Stone magazine, that Paul said when he was asked about Yoko, saying, "The Beatles did not break up because Yoko sat on an amp." So believe Paul. Paul didn't even remember he said that. And she's very charming. She's very fun. She's just sitting there enjoying her life. And John wants her there. He's very happy to have her right next to him. So what? But the most dismaying part of that first part of the documentary, and part 2 is now available, and we're watching that today as well after the football game. What's most dismaying is watching how George is treated. And at the end of part 1, he quits the band. And I had sort of forgotten that. I knew Ringo had quit the band, and then after 3 days came back. But George quit the band and said, "I'll see you in the clubs." And John Lennon's response was, "Well, if George is out, we'll get Eric Clapton to replace him." Which I think is really kind of terrible, but very funny. Because Eric Clapton would later steal George Harrison's wife, and George still was his friend because he said, "What am I supposed to do? He's my best friend." It's an interesting lesson. So the Beatles can continue if George quits, Eric Clapton. If Ringo quits, I don't know, bring back Pete Best. I don't know. But if John Lennon quits, there's no more Beatles. If Paul quits, there are no more Beatles. But George and Ringo, Eric Clapton, get a drummer on the street, will be fine. It's an interesting dynamic. Because separately, they're all superstars and businessmen. And then to keep it all going, they had to all come back together in this room, and we have to come up with 14 songs in 10 days. And George was the youngest. He was 2 years younger than everybody else, so when he goes into that family, he is seen as the baby. "Oh, you're so cute. Don't say anything. Don't talk. Just sit there, play your guitar, and we'll let you know if we need anything from you." And there were a couple of interesting moments in that documentary. One is when George is talking to Paul, and Paul is criticizing George's chord selection and his playing and the sequence of chords that Paul wants played. And George looks at him and says, "I will do what you want me to do, as I always do, but you're wrong." Which is an opening for a conversation, like, "What do you mean, George? Why don't you tell me how we could do it better? Why don't you show me?" And Paul just dismisses him, doesn't even acknowledge what he says. And George is like sitting there just waiting, and there's no response. And then there's another moment when John and Paul, who always kind of sit apart, but then they come together and they both sing together, like the old times, at one microphone, taking turns. It's very early Beatles-ish. And having the time of their life. And George is sitting there on his blue pillow with his guitar, not playing, just watching them. And we're watching George. And he's very upset. And you can tell in his eyes, I believe, that he knows he will never be a part of that. And the other interesting and sort of devastating moment was when they were all sitting around and Paul is panicking because they don't have enough songs. And George brings up, "Hey, guys, I know it's all these songs are Lennon/McCartney, but I've been working on a few songs. I have a few songs that I can contribute since we need to come up with 14 songs in 10 days. I have a few. And he's dismissed, and they change the subject. The next day, George comes back and says, hey, I'm working on this song. It's called I Me Mine. It's based on a 3/4 waltz, something that I was inspired that I saw on television, and I wrote it last night. I'm very excited about it. I'd love to play it for you. And when he first brings that up, Paul's the only one in the room because they're the only ones who were there. John always comes in late. And so he starts playing the song, I Me Mine, rough, for Paul. And Paul's, listens. And then George is finished, and Paul kind of says, well, what was that chord? Doesn't comment, doesn't say, let's work on it, let's play it again, Sam. Dismissed. But George is not going to give up because I Me Mine is a very interesting sort of tune. So later on, he decides to just start, I've been working on it, I'm stretching it out, I'm making it work. I'm going to play it again. And John is in the room. John, I'm playing this song for you, I Me Mine. Tell me what you think. So he's playing. And what happens? George picks up Yoko, and they start dancing a waltz, which is sort of insulting to George, who is sitting there playing his song and singing his song, and John's not listening. Paul's over there. Ringo's just sitting there. And no one's paying attention to George's song. He's singing I Me Mine. And John Lennon is dancing and doing a jig with Yoko. And you can see the frustration just slowly building, and they're British and they're proper, and they don't yell at each other. They don't scream. They don't fist fight like we tend to do in America. There's just a low, boiling, bubbling of the frog. And George, in that first episode, is boiled. He's there early, he practices, he tries to contribute, and he is repeatedly ignored and dismissed. And he seems to understand that a Beatles album means John and Paul. Once in a while, you get a Ringo song. Once in a while, maybe, if you're lucky, you get a George Harrison song. And George even plays All Things Must Pass, which is an absolutely gorgeous song that did not make it onto a Beatles album, but it was his first solo album release, All Things Must Pass. It's a beautiful album. And if there's any sort of thing like revenge or any sort of artistic reconnaissance that can be done after a career is over, well, after the Beatles break up and they all go their separate ways and they all release their own albums over the years, the most highly reviewed and the most highly praised solo album of any Beatle, living or dead, was George Harrison's All Things Must Pass. It's an absolute classic. And yes, he had help from Paul. He had help from John. They were brothers. They helped each other. But it was George's album. He made the decisions of what songs were on it and how they were played and what they did. So the young brother, baby brother, got ignored in the group of four, but when he goes his own way, he becomes number one, which I'm sure had to be very satisfying for him. So the arc of episode 1 of the Beatles documentary is, we're in a panic, we don't have any time, we don't know where we're going to play, and we don't have any songs. And by the way, George, be quiet. George, you got great ideas. Love that song. Save it for the solo album. The Beatles is Paul and John, not George and Ringo.